morning of October 17th, 1991, began with the kind of quiet that only small towns know. Marlow Ridge stirred awake beneath a blanket of pale fog that clung low to the streets and fields, softening every edge, muffling every sound. The chill of autumn had settled deep into the earth, carrying the scent of wet leaves and chimney smoke through the air. Windows glowed warm against the dimness, kitchens rattled with the sounds of breakfast plates and coffee spoons, and parents shuffled through their familiar routines. It was a day like countless others, predictable, ordinary, yet in retrospect, every second of it would be dissected, remembered, and replayed in whispers for decades to come. Children hurried through their houses, tugging on backpacks, dragging shoelaces across tile floors, their voices rising in bursts of excitement and complaint. Mothers zipped jackets, fathers tied knots into scarves, and siblings fought over the last slice of toast. Radios hummed in the background, tuned to the local news or the soft twang of country music. Clocks ticked steadily, reminding families of the minutes slipping away before the school bell. Outside, the narrow streets glistened with dew, the pavement still slick from the night's dampness. The town's pulse was steady, ordinary, innocent in its ignorance. On the outskirts of Marlow Ridge, yellow paint gleamed faintly in the mist. Bus 23 sat idling near the garage, its engine rumbling low, sending up a faint puff of exhaust that curled into the fog. The driver, William Hargrove, leaned against the frame, sipping from a battered thermos of coffee. He was a man known to every household along his route, steady and unremarkable, a fixture as familiar as the church bell that tolled on Sundays. He tapped his foot against the gravel, checked his watch, and finally climbed into the driver's seat, the door hissing closed behind him. At precisely 7:15 a.m., the bus rumbled forward, its headlights piercing the fog, beginning a journey that should have ended at the steps of Marlow Ridge Elementary. Along its winding route, children emerged one by one from farmhouse doors and narrow porches. They bounded down gravel driveways, lunchboxes swinging, jackets unbuttoned, breath puffing white in the cool air. Mothers waved from doorways, some still in robes, others with damp hair wrapped in towels. Fathers hoisted younger ones onto their shoulders before setting them down at the curb, watching as small hands gripped the rail and little feet climbed the bus's steps. Inside, the children laughed and shouted, filling the seats with the noisy, careless joy of youth. They dropped books, traded jokes, and claimed spots by windows fogged from their breath. William nodded to each of them as they boarded, his hand steady on the wheel. By 7:45, the bus was full of chatter and warmth, rattling along the narrow backroads of the county. Trees arched overhead, their leaves half fallen, scattering the pavement in red and gold. The fog lifted in thin veils, allowing shafts of sunlight to spill across the fields. To the children, it was just another school day math tests, spelling lessons, recess with its brief freedom. To their parents, it was another morning, another routine, another goodbye shouted from the porch. Nothing in those moments suggested the rupture to come, and yet, even as the bus rounded its final bends, there was a stillness to the air, a weight pressing low against the town. Later, mothers would recall an unease they could not name, a lingering chill as they rinsed their coffee cups or folded laundry. Fathers would admit they paused longer than usual at the window, watching the fog cling to the treetops. No one could say why, only that they felt it a sense, fleeting but real, that something had shifted beneath the surface of that ordinary day. By 8 o'clock, Marlow Ridge had slipped into its familiar rhythm. Shops unlocked their doors, trucks rolled toward the mills, and the church bell tolled faintly in the distance. The town carried on, unaware that its children were already gone. The fog was beginning to thin when Bus 23 eased away from the depot, its hulking frame shuddering as William Hargrove guided it onto the narrow road that cut through the heart of Marlow Ridge's farmland. The engine hummed with the familiar growl that had carried generations of children to school, a sound that blended so easily into the fabric of the town's mornings that few even noticed it anymore. The headlights swept across the mist, catching glimmers of wet grass and the red of mailbox flags. Inside the bus, the seats were still empty, the air faint with the sterile scent of vinyl and diesel, waiting to be filled with the chaos of laughter and chatter. William, steady behind the wheel, adjusted his cap and glanced at the mirror, though there was nothing yet to see. He had been driving this route for more than a decade, and each curve, every dip in the road, was etched into him as deeply as the wrinkles on his face. The children called him Mr. H, a simple, unassuming man who never raised his voice, never rushed, who waved at the same neighbors at the same corners every morning. His was a presence the town trusted, dependable, unremarkable, safe. On that morning, his hands rested easy on the wheel, and his mind wandered in the soft haze of routine. The first stop came at a weathered farmhouse with paint peeling from the shutters. The yard smelled faintly of wood smoke, and two brothers came running down the gravel drive, shoes crunching, their mother's voice chasing after them with a reminder about homework. Their laughter carried as they climbed the steps, breathless, cheeks red from the cold. William tipped his head in greeting, pressing the lever to swing the door closed and ease the bus back into motion. By the time he reached the next turn, the boys had already claimed their spot halfway down the aisle, elbowing each other for the window seat. At each stop, the bus grew louder, fuller. Children spilled into the narrow aisle with backpacks slung low, lunchboxes swinging from their wrists. Some were still rubbing sleep from their eyes, yawning as they slumped into the front rows. Others shouted to friends in the back, their voices tumbling over one another like the rush of a creek. The windows fogged quickly, marked by little fingers tracing shapes into the condensation. From his seat, William heard it all: the thud of shoes on the steps, the screech of vinyl as bodies slid across benches, the rising chorus of youth. It was the soundtrack of his mornings, and he listened without listening, eyes fixed on the winding road ahead. Parents lingered at the ends of driveways, waving until the bus turned the corner. For some, it was a habit they hardly thought about. For others, it was ritual, the last glimpse of their child before the long hours of work. One father stood with a thermos in hand, nodding toward William as the bus pulled away. A mother, still in her robe, blew a kiss to her daughter, pressed against the glass. These gestures, so small, so ordinary, would later replay in endless loops in the minds of those left behind. By the time the bus had gathered its full load, the aisle buzzed with energy. Laughter ricocheted off the metal walls, trading cards shuffled between small hands. A girl braided her friend's hair while two boys argued over who would win the Friday night football game. To an outsider, it might have looked chaotic. To William, it was the rhythm of his world, a familiar, reassuring noise that told him everything was exactly as it should be. As Bus 23 crested the hill overlooking the edge of town, the sun finally began to break through the mist, spilling pale light across the fields. The children pressed closer to the windows, watching as the town took shape below them: church steeples, water towers, the faint outline of the elementary school in the distance. William shifted in his seat, adjusting the mirror one more time. For him, it was just another morning's work, another journey that began and ended with nothing more remarkable than a round of hellos and goodbyes. But that morning, the round would never be completed. The bus, steady in its course, was already sliding toward absence, already weaving itself into the fabric of the town's darkest memory. The children inside, laughing and jostling for seats, could not know that their voices, rising so freely, would be the last sound Marlow Ridge ever heard from them. The morning at Marlow Ridge Elementary unfolded as it always did. Teachers filed into classrooms, arms full of papers and lesson plans, greeting one another in the hallways with half smiles and steaming mugs of coffee. The smell of chalk dust and waxed floors lingered in the air, a comforting familiarity that steadied the pulse of the building. The bell rang, sharp and metallic, calling children to their seats. Backpacks thudded against desks, pencils scraped across paper, and the low murmur of lessons began. To anyone watching, it was a perfectly ordinary day. But by mid-morning, an unease had begun to ripple through the halls. At first, it was subtle, a question from a teacher, a note sent to the office. The fifth grade class hadn't arrived. Not one child. The absence was chalked up to a late start, perhaps a delay on the road. Teachers glanced at the clock, made excuses to restless students, and continued with their lessons. Yet the minutes ticked forward, and the seats in the fifth grade wing remained empty. In the office, the secretary called the transportation depot. Her voice was calm, professional, but underneath it was a growing tension. The dispatcher confirmed what everyone already knew. Bus 23 had left on time. It should have been there. 2,000 presses, 4 men are also a. Somewhere between the first farmhouse on its route and the school's front steps, the bus had disappeared. The secretary frowned, tapped her pencil against the desk, and began dialing parents one by one. Each call ended the same yes. Their child had boarded the bus that morning. Yes, they had waved from the porch. No, they hadn't heard anything since. By 9:00 a.m. The whispers spread beyond the office. Teachers leaned into each other's doorways, voices low and uncertain. Something wasn't right. The principal, a man who prided himself on composure, paced the office with the phone pressed tight to his ear, speaking first to the district, then to the police. His eyes shifted constantly toward the clock, each passing minute pressing down like a weight. The thought was unthinkable, but it clawed its way forward all the same. An entire bus does not simply vanish. Parents began arriving, some calm, others frantic. They crowded the office, demanding answers, clutching purses and jackets, voices rising in panic. The staff tried to soothe them, but there were no answers to give. The sheriff's department dispatched patrol cars to the rural roads, retracing the route that Bus 23 had taken. Officers checked ditches, fields, and narrow bridges, but there were no tire marks, no broken guardrails, no sign of metal twisted against the earth. The radio stayed eerily silent. By late morning, the atmosphere at the school had shifted completely. Classrooms no longer buzzed with lessons. Instead, the halls echoed with the shuffle of worried teachers and the whispers of children who sensed something was wrong. Some students craned their necks toward the windows, waiting for the familiar yellow bus to pull into the lot. Others asked questions their teachers couldn't answer. Where are they? Why aren't they here yet? No one could offer comfort. The principal gathered the staff in the library, his voice tight as he explained what little they knew. The words fell heavy in the room. The bus had vanished. No one could find it, and until they did, no one was to say anything to alarm the younger children. But the truth needed no words to spread. It hung in the air, thick and undeniable, settling into every corner of the building. By noon, the silence at Marlow Ridge Elementary was no longer the ordinary hush of a school day. It was the suffocating quiet of dread, the absence of voices that should have filled the halls. Desks sat empty, untouched, waiting for children who would never arrive. Teachers stared out the windows, parents clutched one another in the office, and the entire town, though it didn't yet know it, was beginning to hold its breath. Something terrible had happened, and the ordinary world of that October morning had already slipped beyond their grasp. The first hours of the search carried the brittle edge of disbelief. It was easier, in those early moments, for parents and teachers to imagine some mistake, a detour or delay, than to accept the darker possibility pressing in from the corners of their minds. Patrol cars swept through the main streets of Marlow Ridge, lights flashing in the fog, their sirens muted but urgent. Officers leaned from their windows, peering down ditches and into hedgerows, scanning for the unmistakable gleam of yellow metal. Helicopters were called in from the county, their blades chopping the air above as they traced the back roads, circling fields and winding riverbanks. The sound rattled through the town, a constant reminder that something was terribly, impossibly wrong. At first, volunteers surged with determination. Neighbors gathered at the town hall, pulling on boots and jackets, clutching flashlights even though the sun was still rising higher. Maps were spread across folding tables, fingers tracing the familiar routes, marking creeks, bridges, and stretches of gravel road where an accident might have happened unseen. Farmers offered their trucks and their land, opening gates so search parties could comb through fields and thickets. The air hummed with the fever of action, the need to do something. By midday, the sheer absence of evidence had begun to gnaw at everyone's resolve. No broken guardrail, no skid marks carved into asphalt, no shattered glass glinting in the weeds. The bus, heavy and bright, could not simply slip away without leaving a trace. Yet the countryside gave nothing back. The fog that had cloaked the morning had lifted, revealing the full sweep of the land, and still the searchers moved through it empty-handed. Some muttered about back roads the driver might have taken, others about wrong turns and mechanical failures, but the theories rang hollow against the silence of the fields. Parents walked alongside officers, their voices breaking as they called their children's names into the still air, as though the sound might summon them from the brush. Dogs strained at their leashes, noses pressed to the ground, but they found no scent strong enough to follow. Radio chatter grew increasingly strained, each report ending the same. Negative, nothing found. The sheriff, his face carved with exhaustion by early afternoon, called in reinforcements from neighboring towns. Soon, more uniforms and more volunteers filled the roadsides, forming long lines to sweep through the woods, their orange vests flickering against the trees like fragments of flame. The sun hung low by late afternoon, its light stretching thin over the town. Inside the school gymnasium, parents clustered in tight groups, their voices hushed, their faces etched with dread. Coffee urns stood half-drained on long tables, sandwiches went uneaten. The mayor spoke words of reassurance, but his voice wavered, betraying the truth. They had no idea where the children were. Each hour that passed deepened the fracture between hope and fear, until the two became indistinguishable, a desperate cycle of prayer and panic. As night began to fall, flashlights bobbed across the fields, their beams thin and shaky against the vast darkness. The helicopters returned, their searchlights sweeping over rivers and ravines, but the shadows seemed only to deepen around them. Families stood on porches with hands clasped, listening to the distant hum of engines and the occasional bark of dogs, waiting for some signal, some word. But the night offered no answers, only the hollow echo of voices calling into the dark. By the time the first day ended, exhaustion had set into every bone, every breath. Still, no one could stop. The town clung to the belief that the bus must be out there, waiting to be found, that the children were huddled together somewhere in need of rescue. Yet, beneath that fragile hope, an unspoken fear had begun to take root. Marlow Ridge, so small, so quiet, had always seemed a place immune to tragedy. But now, with an entire bus vanished without a trace, the people of the town found themselves staring into a void they had never imagined. A void that threatened to swallow not just their children, but their very sense of safety. And the search, relentless as it was, had only just begun. The following days in Marlow Ridge were marked not by answers but by whispers. As the official search pressed on with deputies, volunteers, and state investigators combing every stretch of land, the townspeople began to fill the silence with their own explanations. Rumors grew like weeds in the cracks of despair, spreading from the schoolyard to the diner, from church pews to the checkout lines at the grocery store. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the same haunting question: how does an entire bus vanish? At first, the talk clung to the practical. Some suggested the bus had slid into one of the deeper ravines, hidden from view beneath a blanket of brush and shadow. Others swore it must have gone off course, that perhaps William Hargrove, steady as he had always been, had suffered a heart attack or stroke, sending the bus into some forgotten corner of the countryside. But as search parties returned each night empty-handed, as dogs failed to pick up any trail, and helicopters reported no signs from the sky, the explanations grew stranger, darker. By the end of the first week, some began to whisper about kidnappings. The idea seemed absurd at first. How could anyone take an entire bus unnoticed? But it spread all the same. Theories of hijackers or organized groups made their way into late-night conversations, where parents sat huddled with cups of cold coffee, voices low so their younger children would not hear. Others leaned towards supernatural explanations, recalling old stories of strange lights in the woods, of the lake at the edge of town that had always seemed deeper than it should be. An old man at the bar told anyone who would listen that the land itself was cursed, that it had swallowed things before. His words, though laughed off in daylight, stuck in the minds of those who woke in the small hours of the night to an empty silence. The media descended quickly, reporters setting up cameras on the town square, their microphones thrust toward tearful parents and exhausted officers. News vans parked in rows, their satellite dishes piercing the skyline like strange metal trees. For the people of Marlow Ridge, the intrusion was both comfort and wound. Comfort, in the sense that the world now shared their grief, that help might come from beyond their borders. Wound, because the cameras caught their pain raw and unguarded, beaming it across the nation for strangers to dissect. In the flicker of television screens, Marlow Ridge became less a town and more a headline. Entire bus of children missing. Inside the school, the atmosphere was unbearable. Empty desks sat untouched, books stacked neatly, papers waiting for hands that would never return to claim them. Teachers moved like shadows, trying to hold lessons together for the children still there, though every word seemed thin, every smile forced. Hallways that once rang with laughter now echoed with a hollow quiet. Parents arrived early for pickups, clutching their children's hands tightly, as if the act alone could keep them from slipping away too. Each night, as darkness fell and the searchlights swept over fields, the rumors thickened, spilling into prayers, into nightmares. The sheriff spoke firmly at town meetings, promising that every road, every mile of the river would be searched, but even his voice could not quiet the speculation. The absence of evidence had become its own kind of evidence, proof that something far more terrible, far more inexplicable had taken place. And so the town lived in a limbo of waiting, caught between hope and resignation. Doors were locked earlier, lights left burning in windows, families clung tighter to one another. Conversations broke off when children entered the room. The rumors kept spreading, unstoppable, because in the silence left by Bus 23's disappearance, people needed stories to make sense of the void. Yet with each passing day, the truth seemed to slip farther away, just beyond reach, like the fading echoes of laughter that still seemed to linger in the air. The day William Hargrove drove Bus 23 for the last time began as unremarkably as any other. He rose early, long before the first blush of dawn, padding across the creaking floorboards of his modest farmhouse. The October chill hung in the air, sharp enough to make him pull his sweater tighter around his frame as he brewed his morning coffee. The routine was familiar, comforting 2 slices of toast, a single egg fried in butter, the paper unfolded beside his plate. He had driven the school bus for nearly 20 years, and in that time, he had built his mornings into a quiet ritual, a steady rhythm that carried him into the day. Neighbors often described William as dependable, the kind of man who could be set by a clock. He was punctual to a fault, rarely deviating from his schedule. Yet beneath that reliability lay a man marked by solitude. His wife had passed years earlier, and his only daughter had left Marlow Ridge for the city. He lived alone now, his evenings quiet, his mornings long. Still, the children he drove each day gave him purpose. Their laughter, their chatter, the small hands waving from the windows, these were the sparks of warmth in his otherwise muted life. That morning, as he sipped his coffee, he paused by the window, staring out across the fog that clung low to the fields. It was thicker than usual, curling in ghostly tendrils across the fence posts and dirt road. Some later swore he lingered there too long, staring into that grayness, as if weighing something unseen. But no one could know his thoughts in that moment, and he never lived to share them. By 6:30 a.m., he was at the depot, the keys to bus 23 jingling in his hand. Mechanics noted nothing unusual. Tires sound, fuel tank full, engine purring steadily. William climbed into the driver's seat with the ease of long habit. His thermos set beside him, his hands firm on the wheel. He nodded to a fellow driver, exchanged a few words about the weather, and pulled out onto the narrow road that wound toward the first stop. Along the route, parents recalled seeing him clearly. One waved from her porch as her son boarded the bus. Another remembered the familiar squeal of the brakes at the end of her drive, the warm glow of the bus's headlights cutting through the fog. Children climbed aboard with their backpacks and lunchboxes, greeting William with the casual affection of routine. He was the steady figure at the helm, the one who ensured they arrived at school safely each day. And yet, something about him that morning stuck in memory. One child later told his mother that William had seemed quieter, that his eyes lingered in the rearview mirror longer than usual. Another remembered him humming softly under his breath, a tune she could not recognize. Small details, easily dismissed in the moment, but they became haunting fragments in the retelling. Clues that perhaps the driver had sensed something none of them could name. By the time the bus made its final turn toward the main road into town, William had nearly completed his route. Every child who should have been on board was present, every seat filled with laughter, arguments, and whispers of plans for recess. Parents watched the bus disappear into the fog, expecting to see it later in the day, expecting the same routine to unfold as it always had. But William Hargrove and the children of Bus 23 never arrived. In the years that followed, people debated endlessly what might have gone through his mind in those last hours. Was it illness, confusion, or something else entirely that led him down a path unseen? The man who had carried the town's children for decades left behind no answers, only the shadow of his absence. The story of his last day became less about the man himself, and more about the mystery he was swallowed by a reminder that even the most ordinary mornings can end in ways that defy understanding. For as long as anyone in Marlow Ridge could remember, the lake had carried an uneasy weight. It lay on the outskirts of town, a wide, slate-colored stretch of water bordered by pines and thick underbrush, its surface often rippling with winds that seemed to come from nowhere. Children were warned away from its banks, told stories of hidden currents and sudden drop-offs that could drag even strong swimmers into the depths. Parents recited these warnings not only out of caution, but also because of the darker stories that had lingered for generations. Stories that painted the lake not as a place of recreation, but as something brooding, watchful. Long before Bus 23 disappeared, the lake had a reputation for swallowing things. Fishermen spoke of gear lost without explanation, of boats drifting into strange patches of fog only to emerge moments later in disorientation. Some claimed the water never gave back what it took. In the 1960s, a young boy vanished while playing along the shoreline. His bicycle was found on the muddy bank, its wheels still turning, but his body was never recovered. A few years later, a truck skidded off a nearby road in icy weather and plunged into the shallows. When divers went in, they brought back twisted metal and debris, but no trace of the driver. Whispers of curses and restless spirits wove themselves into the fabric of local lore, until the lake became less a landmark and more a shadow, always present on the town's edge. Some residents dismissed these tales as superstition, the embellishments of frightened minds, but even they admitted that the lake seemed oddly resistant to intrusion. No one swam in it, few fished there. On misty mornings, when the fog rolled across its surface like smoke, it looked less like water than an open wound in the land, vast and impenetrable. Hunters passing through the woods at dawn sometimes swore they heard voices carrying across the still surface faint, almost like laughter, before vanishing into silence. When Bus 23 disappeared, it did not take long for the rumors to turn toward the lake. Though the official search covered every backroad, every ravine and culvert, townsfolk began to gather at its edge, staring out over the shifting water, as though expecting to see the bright glint of yellow rise to the surface. The sheriff dismissed the idea. At first, the bus route had no reason to pass that way, and the surrounding terrain made it unlikely. Yet the older residents shook their heads and muttered that the lake had always taken what it wanted, that reason had little to do with it. As the days passed without evidence, the connection between the vanished children and the lake grew stronger in people's minds. Parents who had once scoffed at the tales now found themselves standing on the banks at twilight, clutching their coats tighter, eyes fixed on the water's restless movements. Children, wide-eyed, whispered to one another about monsters beneath the surface, about a darkness that lived in the depths. The lake's reputation, once a matter of uneasy folklore, hardened into conviction. It would take nearly 2 decades before divers returned to that water in search of truth. But even in 1991, in the wake of the bus's disappearance, the lake loomed large in the town's imagination. A silent suspect no one could quite accuse, but no one could forget. And in the silence left by unanswered questions, its reputation only deepened, dark and unyielding as the water itself. As days stretched into weeks without answers, the parents of the missing children found themselves bound together by a grief too heavy for any single family to bear. They gathered daily at the school gymnasium, which had transformed from a place of basketball games and assemblies into a makeshift sanctuary of loss. Folding chairs were arranged in weary circles, coffee urns hissed in the background, and the air hung thick with exhaustion and dread. Parents who once shared only polite nods at pickup time now clung to one another like lifelines, speaking in hushed voices, their faces drawn and pale. Each evening, as the sun sank behind the ridge, many of them walked to the edge of town and lit candles. What began with only a handful of mothers soon swelled into dozens, then nearly the entire community. The flickering lights stretched along Main Street, tiny flames against the encroaching dark, each candle a fragile declaration of hope. They prayed aloud, calling the children's names into the night, voices breaking but unrelenting. Passing drivers slowed, some joining the vigil, others lowering their eyes as though unable to bear the sight. Fathers who were usually stoic now wept openly, their rough hands trembling as they held photographs of smiling sons and daughters. Mothers whispered lullabies as though the children might somehow hear them across the distance. On the steps of the church, Pastor Reynolds stood with a Bible in his hand, though often the words caught in his throat, and he simply let the silence speak for him. That silence, though painful, seemed to bind the town together as much as any prayer. Inside the gym, tables were covered with maps and flyers, photographs of each missing child taped to the walls. Parents clung to the sight of those pictures, running fingers across them as though by touching paper they might bridge the impossible gap between absence and presence. Volunteers handed out stacks of missing posters, which parents took with the desperation of those who could not stop moving, who needed to keep searching even when there was nowhere left to look. Yet the vigil was not only about hope, it was also about endurance. Parents confessed to one another in whispered tones that sleep brought no rest, only nightmares. Some spoke of dreams where they heard their children's voices, faint and far away, calling out for help. Others admitted to moments of irrational hope, where the sound of a school bus engine in the distance made their hearts leap, only to shatter when no yellow vehicle appeared. They clung to one another because they understood what no outsider could, that the waiting was its own kind of torment, a wound that never closed. Reporters often stood at the edge of these gatherings, their cameras recording the wavering candlelight, their lenses capturing grief raw and unguarded. Some parents resented the intrusion, while others welcomed it, believing that the wider the story spread, the greater the chance someone, somewhere, would bring them a lead. But no broadcast, no headline, could quiet the gnawing silence where their children should have been. By the time the second week ended, the vigil had become a ritual, a rhythm as steady as the ticking of a clock. Each night the candles burned. Each night voices rose in prayer or broke into sobs. Each night the townspeople faced the unbearable together. And in that ritual, there was a kind of defiance. They refused to let the memory of Bus 23's children be swallowed by the same darkness that had taken them. The flames, fragile though they were, pushed back against the night. For those who stood vigil, it was not only about finding answers but about holding on to one another, about refusing to let hope slip away entirely. And so Marlow Ridge kept its watch, the glow of candles stretching into the dark, a quiet promise that the children would not be forgotten, not tonight, not ever. When the state investigators arrived in Marlow Ridge, they brought with them an energy that was at once reassuring and unsettling. Their cars rolled into town in a neat convoy, sleek sedans with government plates, their antennas bristling like quills, their occupants stepping out in pressed suits and heavy jackets. They carried clipboards, file boxes, and briefcases that seemed almost absurdly formal against the backdrop of a town unraveling. For the weary parents who had spent nights clutching candles and scanning empty fields, their presence offered a flicker of hope. Finally, professionals, outsiders, people with resources beyond what their small community could muster. But with that hope came unease, because the investigators also represented a shift from a neighborly search to a criminal inquiry, from confusion to suspicion. The gymnasium, which had become the heart of the town's grief, now transformed into a command center. Maps were pinned to the walls with colored tacks marking search grids, photographs of the children were neatly cataloged, and a chalkboard listed every tip called into the sheriff's office. The investigators spoke in clipped voices, their jargon unfamiliar to the townsfolk who hovered at the edges, desperate to glean meaning. Words like leads, patterns, and psychological profile filled the air, abstract terms that seemed too cold for the raw absence of their children. They began interviewing everyone: parents, neighbors, shopkeepers, even children too young to fully understand the questions. Some were asked to repeat their statements multiple times, to clarify details that seemed painfully mundane. What time did you last see the bus? What color was the jacket your child wore? Did you notice anything unusual about the driver? Each question left parents exhausted, but they endured, clinging to the belief that somewhere within these details lay the key to finding their children. As days passed, the investigators' presence grew heavier. Unmarked cars lingered on back roads. Men with cameras surveyed bridges and culverts, documenting every possible hazard. Dogs were brought again, this time more highly trained, their handlers urging them across fields already trampled by volunteers. Divers were dispatched to the river, their dark wetsuits glistening in the pale autumn sun as they slipped beneath the water, emerging with nothing but silence in their eyes. Each negative report chipped away at hope, leaving behind only frustration and fear. The townsfolk, who had once rallied together, began to sense an unspoken shift. The investigators, outsiders with sharp eyes and sharper questions, were not bound by the ties of community. Their job was not only to search, but to suspect. Whispered rumors grew louder. Some parents felt scrutinized, their grief examined as though it might conceal guilt. Others bristled at the suggestion that William Hargrove, the steady, familiar driver, could have been anything other than a victim himself. Tension simmered beneath the surface, as though the investigators had not only come to find the bus, but to expose fault lines the town had long kept buried. Yet for all the discomfort they stirred, the investigators pressed on with tireless focus. They combed through bus maintenance records, traced William's last known movements, examined every inch of the route. They studied weather reports, road conditions, and traffic patterns. They even requested old folklore archives from the county library, quietly acknowledging that sometimes local myths carried seeds of truth. Still, nothing surfaced. No skid marks, no debris, no footprints, no explanation. In the dim hours of night, when the gym lights burned late and the investigators leaned over maps in quiet debate, the parents kept their vigil outside, candles flickering in the dark. Hope clung stubbornly to both groups, though it took different forms, one in the language of evidence, the other in the language of prayer. And between them stretched the unanswered question that neither law nor faith could yet resolve. How does an entire bus vanish without a trace? As the weeks dragged on, with no sign of Bus 23, the vacuum of answers filled with speculation. The official briefings from investigators grew shorter, their language tighter, their expressions more guarded. Each time they stepped to the microphone, the townsfolk leaned forward, hoping for news, but the reports always ended the same. No developments, no breakthroughs. And in that absence, theories began to multiply, some logical, others wild, all tinged with desperation. At first, the suspicions fell on William Hargrove. The steady driver, once described as trustworthy and dependable, suddenly found his entire life under a microscope. Investigators combed through his financial records, questioned his neighbors, and pored over every detail of his personal history. Had he snapped under the weight of loneliness? Had he planned something, taken the children elsewhere? Families bristled at the suggestion, their grief twisting into anger. To accuse William felt like a betrayal, yet the possibility hung in the air, unshakable. Some parents defended him fiercely, insisting he had been like a grandfather to their children. Others, though quieter, began to admit they didn't know him as well as they thought. Soon, the circle of suspicion widened. Some whispered that one of the parents themselves might be involved, that grief could be a mask, that someone in their midst knew more than they admitted. Such whispers fractured the fragile unity the vigil had built. Friends eyed friends differently, conversations grew cautious, and the once solid community began to splinter. Trust, so essential in a small town, was suddenly scarce. Meanwhile, darker theories circulated. A group of teenagers claimed they saw strange lights near the ridge that morning, glowing through the fog. When their story reached the adults, it was dismissed as childish fantasy, yet it fed an undercurrent of fear that something beyond the ordinary was at play. Old stories about the lake's curse resurfaced, now whispered with more urgency. Some insisted the bus had gone into the water, pulled under by currents unseen, the lake holding it tight in its depths. Others leaned into wilder explanations, abduction by outsiders, even talk of government cover-ups or forces not of this earth. The media only fueled the storm. National outlets ran nightly segments, each one featuring a new expert offering theories ranging from criminal conspiracies to paranormal phenomena. The town, once just a dot on the map, became a stage where strangers debated the fate of its children. With each broadcast, the people of Marlow Ridge felt both exposed and exploited, their grief picked apart by viewers who had never set foot in their town. Inside homes, the theories seeped into every conversation. Parents lay awake at night, whispering to one another in the dark. Children, too young to understand, but old enough to sense fear, repeated fragments they overheard talk of monsters, kidnappers, or the lake itself, swallowing the bus whole. Fear reshaped their world, turning ordinary roads into threats, familiar faces into suspects. The investigators tried to tamp down the rumors, insisting they were following leads. That speculation only distracted from the work. But even they could not conceal their frustration. Each theory, no matter how outlandish, grew roots in the absence of truth. And as the list of possibilities expanded, so did the sense that the truth itself might never be uncovered. In Marlow Ridge, suspicion became a language everyone spoke, whether in whispers at the diner, in heated debates at the church, or in the silent glances exchanged at the vigil. With every passing day, the mystery of Bus 23 deepened, not only because of what was missing, but because of what the town had begun to lose in its absence, faith in one another. By the end of that first brutal winter, the once fevered search for Bus 23 began to falter. The maps in the school gymnasium grew yellowed at the edges, the thumbtacks holding them in place loosening under their own weight. The search grids, once updated daily, sat untouched, their colors fading into irrelevance. Investigators, once omnipresent, began to withdraw. The rows of unmarked sedans that had lined Main Street disappeared one by one, leaving only the familiar trucks of townsfolk behind. Where there had once been urgency, now there lingered only silence, a slow erosion of energy that the community could not resist. Officially, the case remained open. The sheriff repeated it often, as though by insisting he could breathe life into the investigation. We are not giving up. Leads are still being followed. But inside his office, the file grew thicker, filled with statements, photographs, and reports that led nowhere. Each tip that once sent officers racing now sparked only a weary sigh. The trail had grown cold, and though no one said it aloud, everyone knew the truth. Time had become the greatest enemy. For the parents, the slow fading of the search was its own kind of cruelty. At first, the nightly vigils still burned bright, candles glowing defiantly against the darkness. But as weeks became months, attendance dwindled. Some parents stayed home, unable to bear the sight of empty chairs, the relentless reminder of absence. Others clung to the ritual, their small flames trembling in the night, as though their persistence alone might pull their children back from the void. The community, once united by grief, now showed cracks. Arguments erupted over fundraising, over theories, over blame. The same neighbors who had once embraced one another now crossed streets to avoid conversation. The media, too, drifted away. The camera crews packed up, the headlines grew smaller, and eventually, the nation turned its gaze elsewhere. What had once been a story of national concern became only a footnote, a tragedy preserved in yellowed newspaper clippings and fading television reels. For the families left behind, the disappearance had not lessened, but the world seemed to insist that their grief had an expiration date. Even the investigators who remained spoke differently. Where once their words had been firm, now they leaned on phrases like ongoing inquiry and pending review. Parents recognized the hollowness in those terms, the quiet acknowledgement that no new answers were coming. And so the case that had begun with sirens, helicopters, and search parties settled into a long, suffocating quiet. In that quiet, rumors filled the space. Some insisted the bus had been taken far from Marlow Ridge, that it was hidden in some remote barn or cave, waiting to be discovered. Others whispered that the children were still alive, kept somewhere far away, beyond the reach of the law. And then there were those who spoke of the lake, of its restless waters, certain that the truth lay just beneath the surface. too deep for anyone to touch. Each theory kept hope alive in its own distorted way, but hope, stretched so thin, became brittle, almost painful. By the second anniversary, the town marked the date with only a brief service at the church, the pews less crowded than they had been. Parents clutched photographs, worn soft from handling, their colors fading with time. The bus, the children, William Hargrove. None had been found. The absence had become part of the town itself, woven into every corner like a shadow that would never lift. The case was not closed, but it was no longer alive. It existed in a limbo of paperwork and memory, cold as the October fog that had swallowed Bus 23 that morning in 1991. And for Marlow Ridge, that coldness was perhaps the most terrifying thing of all, not the tragedy of what was known, but the unending torment of what was not. 18 years had passed since the morning Bus 23 vanished, but in Marlow Ridge, time had never moved in a straight line. For the families of the missing children, each year was a circle that led them back to October 17th, 1991. The world outside shifted new presidents, new technologies, wars fought and forgotten. But here, in this small town, the wound remained open, raw, and unhealed. The children who should have grown into adults were forever preserved in photographs. Gap-toothed smiles, lopsided haircuts, backpacks that seemed comically small now. Parents kept their bedrooms untouched, as though waiting for the sound of footsteps to return. Some homes displayed framed photos in living rooms. Others tucked them away in drawers where they could not glare as reminders. But whether visible or hidden, the absence was constant, woven into the rhythms of daily life. Over the years, families coped in different ways. Some moved away, unable to bear the familiar streets and empty classrooms. Others stayed, their lives bent around the grief like trees warped by wind. A few remarried, a few divorced. The weight of unanswered questions had crushed more than one household. Yet through it all, the memory of Bus 23 lingered like a shadow the town could not escape. Children who had been toddlers in 1991 grew up under its story, told and retold at dinner tables, whispered at sleepovers, used as cautionary tales. They knew the names of the missing as well as their own cousins, even if they had never met them. To them, Bus 23 was not just a tragedy but a myth, a dark parable that defined the borders of their world. Stay away from the lake. Don't walk alone at night. Always be home before the fog rolls in. By 2009, Marlow Ridge itself had changed. The old diner on Main Street had closed, replaced by a chain restaurant. The school had built a new wing, though the plaque near the entrance bore the names of those lost, etched into stone as if to anchor them in place. The vigil had become an annual event now, smaller with each passing year, but still solemn, still lit with candles. The faithful few gathered, not so much in expectation of answers, but to prove that the missing had not been erased. And then, in late spring of that year, something stirred the stagnant air of the case. A group of divers, part of a volunteer search and recovery team training in the region, had chosen the lake on the outskirts of town for exercises. The lake that had always been the subject of whispers, avoided by fishermen, bypassed by swimmers, treated with an almost reverent fear. The divers weren't looking for Bus 23 that day. They weren't even thinking about it. But what they found at the bottom, half buried in silt and tangled in weeds, would pull the wound wide open again. When the news spread, it rippled through Marlow Ridge like a shiver. Parents who had spent 18 years locked in grief felt their hearts lurch with something they had long forgotten: hope, sharp and dangerous. Others recoiled, fearing that what had been uncovered would finally confirm the worst. For nearly 2 decades, the town had lived in a purgatory of not knowing. Now, standing on the edge of revelation, Marlow Ridge braced itself for truths that could never be undone. The lake was still that morning, its surface glassy and dark, reflecting a sky heavy with gray clouds. The divers moved with quiet efficiency, slipping into their wetsuits, checking air tanks, tightening straps. To them, it was routine, another training exercise, another body of water to explore. But to the people of Marlow Ridge, the lake had never been routine. It was a place of whispers, of avoided picnics and canceled fishing trips, a place where parents told children not to wander too close. Its silence had always seemed unnatural, as though the water itself remembered. The first few dives yielded nothing unusual: submerged logs, tangles of weeds, the occasional rusting can. The divers joked with one another over radios, their voices distorted but calm. Then one of them spotted something half buried in the silt, a curved shape, too symmetrical to be natural. At first, he thought it might be part of an old boat, but as he brushed away the muck, the yellow paint emerged, dulled and mottled with algae. yet unmistakable. He froze. His hand hovered over the corroded surface. Over the radio, his voice cracked. "You're going to want to see this." Within minutes, the others gathered, their lights cutting through the murk. Together, they uncovered more of it, the outline of windows, the unmistakable bulk of a vehicle. Letters faint, but visible beneath a coating of grime. School bus. The divers surfaced one by one, their masks lifted, their eyes wide with the kind of disbelief that comes only when a nightmare has taken tangible form. By the time the news reached shore, the town had already begun to stir. Word spread fast in a place like Marlow Ridge. Cars lined the dirt road leading to the lake. Families gathering in clusters, straining to see the divers' equipment, to catch a glimpse of what lay below. Some clutched photographs as though the children in them might somehow rise with the bus. Others stood in silence, hands over their mouths, afraid of what confirmation would mean. Authorities were called immediately. The site was secured, yellow tape fluttering in the breeze. Investigators who had long ago filed away the case now hurried back, their faces drawn and serious. Boats were anchored, winches and cables prepared. The water rippled as machinery hummed to life, the town watching from the banks in a collective hush. For the parents, each moment stretched unbearably. 18 years of waiting pressed down on them as they stared at the lake, the place they had always feared but never fully believed could hold their children. Some prayed aloud, voices breaking. Others whispered their children's names into the damp air. No one left. They couldn't, not now. When the first corner of the bus broke the surface, coated in weeds and dripping with the black water of the lake, a cry rose from the crowd. It was not a single sound, but a chorus, a gasp, a sob, a moan torn from dozens of throats at once. The yellow metal, rusted and dented, gleamed faintly beneath its shroud of muck. The truth, long buried, had finally been dragged into the open. The divers stood silently by as the crane lifted the bus higher, the water streaming off it in sheets. For a moment, time seemed suspended. The children of Bus 23, the driver, the endless questions, everything lay trapped within that hulking shape. And as the bus was hauled onto the shore, the people of Marlow Ridge knew that whatever lay inside would change everything. The crowd held its breath as the bus settled onto the muddy shore, its wheels sinking slightly into the earth as if reluctant to be claimed. The yellow paint, once bright with the promise of school days and childhood chatter, was now faded and corroded, streaked with black algae and deep scars of rust. Its windows were clouded with grime, opaque like blind eyes, giving no hint of what might wait within. For 18 years, the question had hung heavy over Marlow Ridge. Now, standing before the dripping carcass of Bus 23, the answer felt both closer and infinitely more terrifying. Authorities moved in quickly, urging the crowd to stay back, though no one obeyed fully. Parents pressed as near as the tape would allow, their hands gripping one another, faces tight with dread. Every creak of the crane, every splash of water dripping from the bus, felt amplified, the sound of time unraveling. The air smelled of lake mud, metallic and sour, filling lungs already tight with grief. The investigators approached carefully, prying open the bus's corroded door with tools that groaned against the warped frame. The hinges screamed as the seal of 18 years broke. A wave of stagnant air poured out, heavy with decay, so strong that several people gagged. For a moment, no one moved. Then flashlights cut through the gloom inside. Gasps broke the silence. Rows of seats sat where they always had, though many were torn and collapsed, their fabric rotted away. In the dim light, something glimmered, a scattering of lunchboxes, their paint flaking but recognizable. A child's pink backpack lay slumped against the aisle, its zipper corroded shut. Rusted thermoses rolled underfoot as the investigators advanced, their beams of light revealing fragments of a life interrupted. But the most haunting detail was what wasn't there. The seats were empty. Every single one. No children, no driver, no remains at all. The bus, sealed away in the depths for nearly 2 decades, should have been a tomb. Instead, it was hollow, a shell stripped of its most important cargo. For the parents waiting outside, the announcement was devastating. First came confusion, then disbelief, then outrage. Some cried openly, clutching photographs. Others demanded answers the investigators could not provide. How could an entire bus vanish with its passengers, only to be found abandoned beneath the water? Inside the bus, evidence was scarce. Algae coated every surface, papers and fabrics long since dissolved into sludge. Yet certain details unsettled even the most seasoned investigators. The driver's seat was pushed back farther than normal, as though someone taller had sat behind the wheel. Scratches lined the interior walls, some faint, others deep, carved into the metal itself. A broken window toward the back showed signs of force from the inside, though no clear exit path could be determined. The recovery team cataloged every item with meticulous care: backpacks, shoes, fragments of notebooks still clinging to faint pencil marks. Each artifact was placed into evidence bags, handled as if it were sacred. For the families watching, these items were both a lifeline and a torment. Proof that their children had been there. Proof that they had boarded bus 23 that morning. Proof that at some point, something had happened. As night fell, floodlights illuminated the grim scene. The bus sat under their glare like a relic from another world, its secrets finally dragged into daylight but not yet explained. The parents went home with more questions than they had arrived with. The investigators, too, left shaken, their files no longer containing just silence, but now a new mystery. Not only where the children had gone, but how an entire bus could be returned without them. And for Marlow Ridge, the nightmare had begun again, this time sharper, more impossible, more consuming than before. The artifacts were laid out on long folding tables inside the school gymnasium, the same place where search maps had once hung, their grids marked with pins and fading ink. Now, under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights, the items from the bus were arranged like fragments of a time capsule cracked open. Each object was tagged, numbered, and placed inside clear evidence bags, though nothing could mask the weight of what they represented. Parents filed in first, some clutching tissues, others gripping one another's hands tightly, bracing themselves. The investigators moved quietly among them, explaining procedures in low tones, but the parents barely heard. Their eyes were locked on the tables. There were lunchboxes, dented and corroded, their cartoon characters half-eaten by rust. A thermos shaped like a rocket ship, its paint peeling. A child's sneaker, the laces still knotted as though it had been hurriedly tied that morning. The pink backpack, now stiff with grime, sat in the center like a relic on an altar. Inside, a few pages of loose-leaf paper had miraculously survived. The pencil drawings faint but visible stick figures holding hands beneath a sun. A mother collapsed at the sight of it, her cries echoing through the gym. Fathers stood stiffly, staring down at items they recognized all too well. One whispered, "That was his," unable to bring himself to touch the plastic bag that held a toy car. Another shook his head slowly, disbelief clouding his features, as if refusing to accept that these decayed remnants were all that remained of 18 years of waiting. The investigators noted everything with clinical precision, yet even they were visibly shaken. These were not just objects. They were echoes of a vanished morning, proof that the children had indeed been on the bus when it disappeared. But their absence, those empty seats, that hollow silence rendered every artifact both confirmation and contradiction. Strangest of all were the scratches. The metal fragments pried from the bus's walls bore clear markings, jagged grooves running in irregular patterns. Some seemed deliberate, letters half-formed but illegible. Others looked more like frantic clawing, gouges etched deep into the corroded surface. Forensic teams debated their meaning. Were they desperate attempts to escape, or the result of shifting metal and years beneath the lake's weight? No one could say for sure, but the mere suggestion left families trembling. The town gathered that night for an emergency meeting in the church hall. Questions rang out, angry, fearful, desperate. Why had no bodies been found? Why were the seats empty? Who had driven the bus into the lake? For every question, investigators could only offer the same answer: we don't know. But speculation spread like wildfire. Some insisted the children had escaped before the bus sank, though why no trace had ever been found remained unexplained. Others spoke in hushed tones of something darker, forces beyond comprehension that had left only objects behind. Theories flourished, but certainty remained elusive. For the parents, the artifacts were unbearable proof. They had begged for answers, but the fragments only deepened the wound. The bus had been found, yes, but the children were still missing. In many ways, the discovery was worse than the silence had been. Hope, once dormant, had been stirred again, but in cruel, jagged ways, hope laced with horror. As the gymnasium emptied, the objects remained behind under the fluorescent lights, silent witnesses to a mystery that had grown more tangled with time. The bus had surfaced, but the truth still lay submerged, elusive, waiting. Theories spread through Marlow Ridge like wildfire, as though the town itself had been waiting for something to reignite them. With the bus recovered, every diner booth, every church pew, every quiet conversation in grocery aisles turned to speculation. For some, the discovery brought a strange relief, proof that the bus had not vanished into thin air, that there had been something tangible all along. For others, it deepened the dread. The empty seats and silent evidence suggested not resolution, but something even darker, more unexplainable. The simplest theory was the most painful, that the bus had gone into the lake with everyone still aboard, and the bodies had somehow drifted or dissolved in the years since. Scientists were called, experts consulted, but most agreed that after 18 years in cold, deep water, some human remains should still have been present. The absence was too absolute, too clean. Some of the older residents revived their long-whispered suspicions about William Hargrove, the driver. Perhaps he had been responsible. Perhaps he had lured the children off the bus before driving it into the lake. Yet that theory raised more questions than it answered. Where would he have taken them? How could dozens of children vanish without a trace, without even a rumor surfacing over nearly 2 decades? Others whispered of darker possibilities. In hushed tones, some claimed the bus was never meant to be found, that it had been hidden by someone or something powerful enough to keep it submerged in secret until now. The scratches inside the bus became the centerpiece of this theory, interpreted as signs of struggle, or even messages carved in desperation. A few claimed to see words forming in the gouges, though no consensus was ever reached. The more superstitious among the townsfolk spoke of the lake itself. They said it had always been cursed, long before Bus 23. Stories resurfaced about strange currents, about livestock refusing to drink from its shore, about figures glimpsed in the fog. For these people, the bus was not driven into the lake but swallowed by it, claimed by a force that human reason could not explain. To them, the empty seats were not evidence of escape, but of something taken. Parents listened to these theories with hollow eyes. Some clung to the idea that their children had survived, carried off somewhere, living under different names in some hidden place. Others railed against the whispers, unwilling to accept anything other than a rational explanation. But even the most rational struggled when faced with the artifacts laid out in the gymnasium and the yawning silence of what was missing. Investigators held press conferences, urging patience, promising analysis. They spoke of new forensic techniques, of DNA testing on the artifacts, of reconstructing the bus's final movements. Yet behind closed doors, even they admitted that the case had only grown stranger. Every discovery seemed less like an answer and more like another locked door. The theories did not soothe the town. They divided it. Families argued with neighbors, husbands with wives, parents with each other. Grief had once united them. Now suspicion and belief tore them apart. For Marlow Ridge, the resurfacing of Bus 23 was not a closure but a reopening, a wound made fresh. And in the quiet of their homes, when the lights were out and the lake fog rolled close to the town's edge, many found themselves asking not just where the children had gone, but whether they truly wanted to know the answer. Grief had always lived in Marlow Ridge, tucked into the corners of homes and etched into the lines of faces that had aged 18 long years without their children. But after the bus was pulled from the lake, grief shifted into something sharper desperation. For the parents, the return of Bus 23 was not an answer but a cruel taunt. The artifacts were there, the bus was there, but their children were not. It was unbearable. Some parents clung to hope with a renewed ferocity, convinced that the absence of remains meant survival. They began organizing meetings again, just as they had in those first weeks back in 1991. Flyers appeared in shop windows. Old photographs were dusted off and reprinted. Faces of children who should have been adults stared back at the town with smiles frozen in time. Tips hotlines were reopened. Private investigators were hired, draining bank accounts that had barely recovered from years of searching before. For these parents, belief in survival was no longer optional. It was the only way forward. Others, though, spiraled into darker places. For them, the empty bus meant something unimaginable had taken place, something that could not be undone. They sat quietly at meetings, shaking their heads, eyes hollow. Some turned to drink, others to faith, still others to isolation so complete that neighbors no longer knew if they were alive or dead themselves. A few parents began taking matters into their own hands. They drove to nearby towns, knocking on doors of strangers, asking if they had ever seen a child who didn't belong. They haunted libraries, scrolling through decades of missing persons reports. One father was spotted camping near the lake for nights on end, watching the water as if waiting for something to return. Another mother was caught trying to break into the bus, desperate to see it for herself, to sit in the driver's seat, to run her hands along the scratches, and know for certain what her child might have endured. The investigators tried to manage the flood of emotion, but their reassurances fell flat. The parents did not trust them, how could they? These were the same authorities who had searched the lake in 1991 and found nothing. The same men and women who had closed the case year after year, filing away the missing like unsolved math problems. And now, standing before the bus, The parents asked themselves a question more bitter than any before. Had the truth always been within reach, ignored, buried, or covered up? Desperation led to fractures among them. Arguments erupted in town halls and church basements. Some parents accused others of clinging to false hope. Others accused the skeptics of betrayal, of giving up on their children. The unity they once had was gone. In its place was an exhaustion so deep it bled into anger, suspicion, and madness. Yet beneath it all, they shared the same gnawing hunger to know. To know what happened on that bus after it departed. To know why the seats were empty. To know if their children had lived, if only for a little while, and where they might be now. That desperation was a fire that would not burn out, even as it consumed them. And at night, when the town was quiet and the shadows long, some parents swore they could still hear the faint echo of laughter. Children's laughter carried on the wind from the direction of the lake. The bus had been stripped of many answers, but not of all. Among the rust, the scratches, and the scattered belongings, a few details began to whisper at deeper truths. The investigators had cataloged them clinically, but for the families, they were more than just evidence, they were clues, each one demanding to be unraveled. The first came from the carvings etched into the metal walls. Forensic experts initially dismissed them as corrosion or frantic scraping. Yet when photographs circulated among the parents, some swore they could make out shapes. A father insisted that one mark resembled the letter J, his daughter's initial. Another mother claimed to see a crude drawing of a star, something her child had always doodled in the margins of her notebooks. Soon the scratches were no longer just scratches. They were messages, desperate attempts to leave behind proof. Whether that proof was of fear, survival, or something more sinister, no one could agree. Then there was the driver's seat. Its adjustment puzzled investigators. Pushed so far back it could not have been comfortable for William Hargrove. It seemed to suggest that someone else had sat there, someone taller, someone unfamiliar. Yet fingerprints had long since been washed away by the lake. Still, the notion lingered. Who had been behind the wheel when Bus 23 sank? Even stranger was what was missing. Certain items that parents swore their children had carried that morning, specific backpacks, jewelry, toys, were nowhere to be found. It was easy, perhaps too easy, for authorities to suggest they had been lost in the depths or destroyed over time. But for parents who remembered the weight of those objects, who remembered zipping them into bags and watching their children board that bus, the absence was haunting. Had those items been taken? And if so, by whom? One particularly disturbing find came from the mud just outside the bus, discovered as divers combed the lakebed again. A shoe print, faint but unmistakable, preserved in the silt. It was too small to be the driver's, too large to be from a very young child. Forensic teams studied it with fascination and unease. Could it have belonged to one of the missing children, or to someone else entirely? The print raised more questions than it answered, and its discovery was quietly kept from the public for weeks. Whispers spread in town that not all evidence had been disclosed. Some claimed officials were withholding photographs, others that journals or notes had been found inside the bus and hidden from view. Conspiracy theories grew louder, fueled by desperation. Parents began to mistrust not just the authorities but one another, suspecting secrets were being kept even within their own circle. And yet, despite the fear and anger, there was something undeniable in the air, the sense that the truth was closer than ever. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the mystery was not only alive but bleeding fragments of itself into the open. These hidden clues, however fractured and incomplete, promised to lead somewhere. The question was where and whether the families of Marlow Ridge were prepared for the answers they might bring. Marlow Ridge had always been a quiet town, the kind of place where doors were left unlocked and neighbors knew each other's birthdays. But after the bus resurfaced, quiet no longer meant peace. It meant unease. It meant tension simmering just beneath the surface, shadows stretching longer than they should. The town had lived with absence for 18 years, but now it lived with something worse, the return of questions without answers. At night, the lake became the focus of every whisper. Fog curled over its surface like a living thing, and people swore it seemed thicker, heavier, since the bus had been pulled from its depths. Fishermen reported hearing odd echoes across the water, voices that sounded like laughter one moment and like weeping the next. Some refused to go near the lake at all, abandoning long-tended docks and shuttering cabins that had been in families for generations. The children of Marlow Ridge grew up in the shadow of the mystery, and with the resurfacing of the bus, it became more real to them than ever. Teenagers dared each other to sneak down to the water at night, whispering about the missing 29. Some claimed to see shapes moving just beneath the surface. Others returned pale and shaken, refusing to say what they had witnessed. For the older townsfolk, these antics felt less like mischief and more like provocation, as though the lake itself might retaliate for being disturbed. Stores and diners filled with hushed conversations. Every creak of the bus garage, every groan of the crane still parked by the water, was dissected as though it held meaning. Some said the bus had been empty because the children had escaped, running off into some hidden life. Others believed the opposite, that the emptiness was proof they had been taken by something unspeakable, something that had left no trace. Neither possibility brought comfort. Faith surged in some households and collapsed in others. The church pews were packed each Sunday, families clinging to sermons about deliverance and unseen battles. But just as many turned away, unable to reconcile their belief with the horror that lingered unanswered. The divide was palpable, carving new lines through a town already split by grief and suspicion. Even the landscape seemed altered. Parents swore their homes felt colder. Dogs barked at nothing in the middle of the night. Old houses creaked as if under a weight no one could see. The missing had always been a wound in Marlow Ridge, but now the wound felt infected, festering into something alive, something that pressed down on every waking moment. The investigators, too, were haunted. Some admitted privately they dreamed of the bus, of stepping inside only to hear faint footsteps behind them. Others confessed to hearing children's voices while sifting through the artifacts in evidence storage. Rational minds told them it was exhaustion, stress, grief made contagious. But in the silence of their offices, more than one found themselves staring at the evidence bags for far too long, as though waiting for them to move. The town was no longer living beside a mystery, it was living inside one. The resurfacing of Bus 23 had not just reopened old wounds, it had changed Marlow Ridge, twisting it into a place where every sound, every shadow, every ripple of water felt like part of the story. And until answers came, if they ever did, the town would remain haunted by the children, by the bus, by the silence that refused to break. The recovery of Bus 23 was supposed to bring closure. Instead, it left the town of Marlow Ridge suspended in a deeper kind of torment, one defined not by the absence of evidence, but by its cruel fragments. After 18 years of silence, the bus emerged from the depths like a ghost, and yet it spoke in riddles rather than answers. For the parents, the questions had become unbearable. They sat awake at night, replaying that foggy October morning in 1991 over and over again. How had a bus filled with children simply vanished? Who had been behind the wheel when it went into the lake? Where were the missing? The clues only deepened the torment. The scratches on the walls, the empty seats, the belongings left behind, the footprints in the silt, all of it felt like pieces of a puzzle. But no matter how they were arranged, the picture remained incomplete. The investigators issued reports, held press briefings, and promised further analysis. But even as DNA tests were conducted and every scrap of evidence cataloged, their conclusions never reached the clarity the families longed for. Science could explain some things, the corrosion of metal, the slow decay of cloth, the shifting of objects in water, but not everything. It could not explain why no remains were found. It could not explain the strangeness of the scratches. It could not explain why so many parents swore certain items were missing from the wreckage. The town itself fractured under the weight of those unanswered questions. Some people insisted that the children were still alive somewhere, hidden away. Others believed that something unspeakable had claimed them, something no report could put into words. Between those two extremes, faith, hope, and despair battled endlessly, leaving Marlow Ridge forever changed. The lake, once just a body of water, became a symbol of everything unknown. Its surface reflected the sky as it always had, but to the townsfolk, it was no longer just water. It was a grave, a vault, a mirror of unanswered prayers. Few dared to visit its shores anymore, and those who did swore they felt watched, as if the missing 29 lingered there, half present in a world that refused to let them go. The story of Bus 23 spread beyond Marlow Ridge, carried by journalists, whispered on true crime forums, debated in documentaries. But no matter how far the tale traveled, the ending was always the same. There were no answers, just echoes, just shadows, just the reminder of 29 children and a driver who had boarded a bus one foggy morning and never returned. Time would continue to move forward, as it always did. Leaves would turn, snows would fall, and children too young to remember the tragedy would grow up hearing it as legend. But for those who lived it, the mystery would never fade. It lingered in every quiet street, every shuttered home, every ripple of the lake. And so, the final truth of Bus 23 was not in what was found, but in what remained hidden. The bus had surfaced. The questions had not.